Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Review. Stop that. Tonight, we take a look at the vampire phenomenon sparked by Dan Curtis's 1960s daytime TV drama, Dark Shadows. Dark Shadows was the original supernatural soap opera, and it began right around the time the Addams Family and the Munsters were canceled. But instead of being a comedy that poked fun at the macabre, it was gothic high drama, with all the cliches a soap opera could provide. The show struggled for the first season and was threatened with cancellation. So Curtis did the only logical thing to save it. He introduced a vampire character. This is Barnabas Collins. He was recently brought back from the grave by Johnny Depp in the new Tim Burton movie, but he was originally immortalized by the incomparable Jonathan Frid. Although he was initially meant to only provide a 13-week story arc, almost immediately after his introduction to the show, Barnabas Collins rose to the status of the second most popular vampire character in the world. Even though the show was canceled over 40 years ago, its spirits lived on with countless fan clubs, merchandise, publications, novelizations, comics, and even a convention that got so popular and mainstream that the fans had to make a second convention just to get back their hardcoreness. So why was Barnabas Collins so popular? Well, to start, this was the first time we had a really serious, recurring vampire character on public television. This was a chance to see something dark and thrilling and sophisticated that was normally only available in the movies, and teenagers and women especially got hooked. The forbidden boundaries he pushed excited audiences as they toyed with the taboo.
It was naughty.
It's no wonder why a young Tim Burton was a huge fan of the show and why Barnabas was one of Johnny Depp's all-time favorite characters. So why did the Biffles do such a poor job adapting the beloved Barnabas and the renowned Dark Shadows for a modern audience? Come now. I don't think it's any secret that the movie that came out last week has been publicly agreed upon as being downright awful. Honestly, what could you expect from a screenplay by the guy responsible for the lame writing in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies? The only decent lines in it were ripped straight out of the show.
Do you let them call you Vicky when your name is Victoria? The name Victoria is so beautiful to me, I couldn't possibly surrender a syllable of it.
But what's so bad about it? Why did a deliberately comedic yet heartfelt interpretation of an admittedly campy and dated soap opera not land well with a contemporary audience? Even though there's much more to Dark Shadows than Barnabas' character, a large part of the answer lies with the focus on vampires and how their portrayals have changed over the past 40 years. It's because Barnabas Collins was never originally intended to be a hero or a protagonist, or even likable. He was written to be a villain, to create conflict for the other characters in the show and provide temporary plot. He was supposed to be thrilling and mysterious and cause suspense, sure, but the creators never expected audiences to become so enamored with him. He just happened to be such a well-done character that it turned out that way. Nowadays, it's so cliche for vampires to be brooding protagonists that Depp and Burton fell into the trap of approaching it from the opposite angle. Instead of trying to make a vampire character who just happened to turn out to be likable, they tried to make a likable character who just happened to be a vampire. And failed. In the original series, for a long time, Barnabas is jealous and prideful, violent and deceitful, a wolf in sheep's clothing. The other characters think of him as a gentleman because he's formal and proper and old-fashioned, but he's lying through his teeth with almost every line and doesn't regret a moment of it because he's only focused on his selfish desires. Eventually, over the course of years, his character grows into a compassionate person who makes up for his villainous misdoings by protecting and prioritizing his loved ones. But this only comes after many sagas of cheating on his lovers, murdering innocents, brutally beating his servant, trying to hypnotize multiple women into believing they're his dead fiancé and forcing them to marry him. You don't get much more melodramatic, mustache-twirling soap opera villain than that. And yet, because of his tortured past, and the lessons he's learned as he's developed layers as a character, he won the hearts of the audience, who made him their hero.
And I would rather be dead than have to go through eternity as what I am.
How many of the vampires we've had in the past 40 years were directly inspired by the popularity of Barnabas? Most of them? But here, we have the prototypical unwilling vampire before they were over-sexualized. He's not played by a young hunk of man-meat, but by a classical actor whose attractiveness comes out of his depth, not from his abs. And the new movie just could not grasp that. Come on, Johnny and Timmy, a fanboy should know better. Now, you may say it's not fair to compare a 2-hour movie to a show that had 1,245 episodes to flesh out a character. Alright, so let's narrow our focus to the first movie that was made based on the show. 1970's House of Dark Shadows was one of the first times a TV show was brought to the big screen. Having common sense, they decided to base the film around the vampire's storyline. And without the restrictions of TV censorship or the need to not kill off recurring characters, they were able to make what's considered by many to be one of the best vampire films of the decade. It came out well after Barnabas had become a good guy in the TV series, but in this film, he's back to his villainous roots as the classic horror figure we once expected from a film vampire. He is moved by the passion of his nature to brutally attack even his loved ones, and he uses his dark powers to deceive and torment in order to obtain the woman he imagines as his dead fiancé reincarnated. In the new Dark Shadows movie, Depp's Barnabas is stripped of practically all the character traits that perhaps the filmmakers might have feared would make him unlikable to the audience. Instead of cheating on his fiancée Josette with the witch Angelique and then forsaking her, he dumps Angelique before even meeting Josette. Instead of the horror of his monstrousness causing Josette to be repulsed by him and kill herself, her suicide is a result of Angelique's spell before he even becomes a vampire. Instead of lying to everyone when he awakens in the modern era, he's forced into the charade by Elizabeth, who has to constantly cover for him as he innocently can't even keep from giving himself away over and over again. He's such a good guy that he can't even be deceptive. And instead of putting his own desires for the vampire bride to replace Josette first, his main focus is on helping the family and restoring them to their former status. His love story takes a back seat and feels tacked on and only for the sake of humor.
She has the most fertile birthing hips I have ever laid eyes upon.
He doesn't hypnotize Victoria to try to make her replace Josette. There are no forced wedding attempts. All we're left with is Johnny Depp being charmingly befuddled. And the fact that he's from the past and not used to the modern era takes over almost entirely from the fact that he's a vampire. He calls himself a monster, but the movie never really shows us that he is. And so instead, he just comes off as a self-pitying whiner.
Why have you done this to me?
Even when he does murder people, he doesn't act like he suffers any emotional consequences afterwards. He apologizes before he does it, and I guess this is their attempt to show that he's a gentleman? But saying, "I'm terribly sorry I'm going to have to brutally murder you now," doesn't make you prim and proper. It makes you kind of psycho. Talks about being tortured by being a vampire. But even though he brutally murders the road crew, a bunch of hippies, and Julia, who's been made thoroughly unlikable as well, his reaction is practically flippant, and yet he still gets pity points for the fact that he says he feels bad, while not even behaving like he possesses the mental capacity to understand what suffering consequences means. For the most part, he just comes off as kind of dumb. Frid's Barnabas was a gentleman, but he was conniving. And when he killed people, it was because the violence of his nature took over and enraged him. And then his subsequent feelings of torture and regret were compelling to the audience. Depp's Barnabas sweeps the crimes under the rug and hopes the audience just forgets them, instead to focus on how adorable he is when he's trying to find a place to sleep. Or how hot he is when he's having a wall-smashing sex scene. Even when the police show up at the climax, once they've been told he's a murderer, instead of having to answer for those crimes of which he's fully guilty, they're swept aside and the cops just wander away while he fights with Angelique over the fact that she wants to bone him and he's just not that into her. You know, the important stuff. Interesting how practically the only other real male character in this was sent packing halfway through the movie, conveniently leaving Johnny Depp surrounded by beautiful women who all want in his pants. Why? Because vampires are sexy, right? Because Johnny Depp is sexy, right? Because that's what the audience wants to see, right? Instead of using the fact that the character's a vampire and all the struggles that go along with that, the new movie did all it could to avoid the consequences of the vampire, to try to force the character to be likable. And in the end, all we've got is a confused, dull guy who's perhaps a bit creepily insane. New Dark Shadows comes to us in an era where there's so much vampire cliche and stigma to fish through that it's almost impossible to do something as new and original as Barnabas was when he rocked our world back in the 60s. The only comparison at the time was Dracula, and Barnabas offered a fresh face for young audiences to latch onto. Just like Dracula, he was a dapper, distinguished, forbidden love. But he could be fixed and won over and humanized. Literally, in fact. He was cured several times throughout the series. He was a sympathetic antagonist that became an identifiable protagonist. Things that the original Dracula was just too monstrous to ever cross the line into being. Barnabas is what the darkness-loving audiences wished Dracula was, and what we've tried to make him over and over again in subsequent years. So, does that mean that it was just impossible to make a good, new, fresh Dark Shadows movie in this day and age? Was there no way to make a likable Barnabas while still respecting his villainy? No, I don't think so. Now, a lot of people are complaining that the new movie was little more than a parody of the original, turning an, albeit campy, but straight play drama into an Austin Powers-style comedy. But if that's what they'd actually done, it might have worked. For instance, see this flyer I got in the mail last week? Potted Potter, all 7 Harry Potter books in 70 hilarious minutes. The unauthorized Harry Experience, a parody by Dan and Jeff. Now, to me, that sounds awesome! And I'm as serious about Harry Potter as the next nerd, but I'm not above poking fun at something I love, especially vampires. But that's not what this movie did. It didn't go all the way with the parody. Instead, it tried to be a heartfelt film about family values and moral righteousness with a fish-out-of-water comedy gently sprinkled throughout. And I mean gently.
15 and no husband. You must put those birthing hips to good use at once, lest your womb shrivel up and die.
Oh, was that a joke? I'm terribly sorry I didn't notice it there. And it certainly wasn't a dark, atmospheric horror movie about a mysterious stranger smiling in his family's face while he brutalizes the neighborhood. I don't get it. If Johnny Depp loved the character so much, why couldn't he do him the respect of giving him depth? Was he really so afraid for his quirkily lovable heart of gold image that he willingly sabotaged the tone of something he held in such high regard? I'm not saying House of Dark Shadows is perfect, or would even be considered a good movie at all by today's standards. Despite how well loved it was at the time, viewing House of Dark Shadows now, one is distracted by the constant swinging camera shots and the rushed plot as they try to squeeze years of story development into an hour and a half.
You're in love with him.
But there's no denying that it is at least both dark and shadowy. A comedy, this is not. Its story is actually very similar to Dracula, but it has enough fresh twists that it feels like an homage, not a ripoff. And even for those who have no knowledge of the original series, this film shows us a Barnabas who is truly tormented. A villain, but he has hopes and dreams and feelings, and so is only more tortured by the fact that he can't help indulging in his evil desires. He goes from being sweetly romantic and genuinely heartfelt, to violent and domineering as his emotions are rocked by his turmoil. And instead of walking in the door preaching a saint-like attitude about the importance of family, even his own cousins aren't safe from his attacks and cruel demands.
You are never to go near Todd again.
I want him, and I'm going to have him. I need him.
Now
Not only are you to leave Todd alone, but you are not to touch anyone at Collinwood. Is that clear?
Oh, don't be put off, Barnabas. That never works for me either. Lindsay. I want you to forget about Todd. Never think of Todd again.
I want you to pay your part of the rent. I want you to stop disposing all your income on vampire shit and pay your part of the rent.
I'll get back to you on that. You saw nothing. Here, we have an attractive gentleman with old world manners that ends up killing off half his own family. He doesn't do it in a calm, chivalrous way like a psycho. He does it fueled with passion like a well-rounded, flawed character. But due to the subtle complexity of his story, he still comes off as compelling to the audience. Instead of us rooting for him to be defeated at the end, despite all his evil deeds, we're clinging to the hope that he may yet be redeemed. And we're left a bit heartbroken and introspective when we see him get slain. In House of Dark Shadows, the girl is rescued before she's forced to become his vampire bride, and Barnabas is killed as he never could be in the TV show. But the original ending to the show that never saw the light of day before it got canceled had him finally realizing he loved his best friend Julia, getting cured of his vampirism, and the two of them living happily ever after as best they could with the consequences both their past actions had brought them. A good ending for a good character, and well earned for all the struggles he'd endured and how much he'd grown. The end of the new Dark Shadows movie leaves us with him defeating an unsympathetic villain and not having grown or changed at all. He's just as befuddled and genuinely morally upright as he started. He gets the girl who actually wants to be a vampire like him, and presumably, despite the town knowing what he is, he's able to go back to his family plan, and we're left just not giving a damn. Now, I understand why the Tim Burton movie didn't play it straight and do it for real. After all, pseudo-Dracula has been done hundreds of times before. But they didn't push it far enough either. It could have been all-out comedy or all-out horror. A full-on parody that played on the way vampires have changed in society's viewpoint in the past decades could have been insightfully hilarious. Or an actually suspenseful and heart-wrenching story of a vampire ruining his own family through the monstrousness of his nature could have been terrifying. But the Tim Burton movie was afraid to take risks, and we were left with a forgettable movie and an impossible-to-like character. It's like Tim Burton and Johnny Depp forgot that when you're developing a character, you have to write them as a person first and let the attractiveness come out of their personality. Instead, they wrote lovable will-be sex on a stick, shallow and completely hypocritical trope whore, and hoped the audience would imagine a character out of it. What must that concept session have looked like? Lindsay, you think you're Tim Burton, and I am Johnny Depp, and we're having a business meeting.
Tim Burton, right. Vertical stripes, lots of eyeliner, Danny Elfman, daddy issues, blonde ingenue.
Yes, so Barnabas.
Barnabas, right. Ladies love Barnabas.
Why? Because he's tortured.
Yeah, tortured. Okay, we can work with that.
But he's good underneath it all.
Yeah, good. Okay, so no flaws, right? Got it.
Except he kills people.
Right, there's that.
But he's really sad that he has to do that.
Right, yeah, sad is good. Pouty, yeah, it's good.
Chicks love the pouty.
Yeah, he's the sex.
Everyone wants him, hell, even I want him.
Me too, but don't tell my wife.
Your wife wants him.
Damn right she does. Let's put a scene where she sucks his cock.
Done! So done! But he's gotta have a real sex scene too.
Yeah, vampire sex is hot, but with who? One of the relatives?
Too creepy.
The innocent virginal girl?
You kidding? No one wants to see that.
What about the witch? Witches are hot.
Yeah, hot. But won't that derail their character conflict?
Don't worry. Immediately after, we'll make it so it's changed nothing, and it'll be like it never happened.
Perfect. What else?
Well, I'm going to do more important things.
Not again. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and remakes are hard, but formulaically pandering to genre trends will only hurt you in the end.
I want you to pay your part of the rent.
I'll get back to you on that.
I want you to remember who I am. For the love of God, I live with you.